All right, welcome, Digital-Roundtable. The crew is here in full force today, and we have a great guest speaker that we'll get to you guys in a moment. Thank you, John, for that fabulous, soothing tune. How are you gentlemen doing today? John Butler, how is life?
Life is fine. Very, very interesting times. And Llewelyn, my great colleague in the movement of ideas, we were discussing some of the great things that's happening in America that's unprecedented in America. And it has a little to do with the virus, but not much. So I'm doing fine. I'm watching with great interest all of the great things in terms of business models and how new technologies are trying to solve what we do. As a matter of fact, we're in a place where government has never been before, with the exception maybe of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So I am doing fine. It's a great day in Austin, Texas. It's a little cool. I had a great golf game. I shot an 81 and should have been a 75.
There you go. Llewelyn, how are you doing today?
Very well, thank you. Very well. The weather is here. It was 99 yesterday, which is very unusual in New England. It's down around 94 today, which seems just fine because there's a breeze. A lot of people are out in the water, a lot of people sailing and boating, probably to work, and probably because they're supposed to be working at home. I wonder what the effect on recreational boating and working at home will be. Someone should do a study.
Right. Absolutely. So we got a guest speaker today who has some things in common with me. So Austin Trees is a vice president at JLL, and JLL is a phenomenal company in the real estate industry. They do, property management and financing, and they do smart buildings, and they do all kinds of cool things around commercial real estate globally. They're a huge company with tens of thousands of employees and offices in more countries that I've been to that I care to visit. So they're global dominance, and they have a interesting new Q2 report that we're going to hear from Austin a little bit on. And in full disclosure, Austin is a Jayhawk, Rock Chalk, Jayhawk. So Austin, how are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Well, thanks for being with us. We'll get on with it and let you participate and have some questions for you. So let me get to quickly the summary of the news for the week. So we always start with COVID, and the death toll is up 7,000 folks, 7,042. That's the last time I checked. It's trending flat on the death side, and on the cases it's up 460,000 or so up from last week, but it's trending flat. So it's not spiking from week to week. It's now sort of normalizing from week to week. So that's encouraging. It may be something for just this week, but it's clearly encouraging. I think that we're all over the map when it comes to soft openings and closings, and we have seen what's going on with sports and baseball and hockey and all of the above. And baseball is probably having the biggest challenge because they're all traveling too many places. There are too many interactions with people. They probably should rethink what they're going to do based on what hockey and basketball are doing, which is probably those leagues may have a better likelihood of finishing and then crowning a champion by having full attendance for competition versus what's potentially happening in baseball. So we'll see what happens. The stock market is down 500 points from last week. The New York Stock Exchange Index is slightly up 120 points, and NASDAQ is down 170 points. So I think the market's finally slowing down. However, the Fed just announced that they're going to maintain interest rates where they are. So we have yet another, 90 days of no change in the dial on interest rates. And so the sales of homes and mortgages and refinancing continues to be skyrocketing through the roof, and the supply of new homes, it's almost nil. And so there is an incredible, reshifting going on that. The price of crude oil, it's down cents from last week. The price in Metro Austin is up 4 cents from last week. And you probably all know that Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and Google CEOs are being grilled right now live on TV in an investigation led by Congress and the FTC. So, gentlemen, what do we think about what's happening? How are we doing this week versus last week? Llewelyn.
Well, I think things are I'm pretty pessimistic. I think the COVID situation is out of control. I don't share your optimism at all. We have not on top of it. We have 150,000 dead Americans as a result of this virus. We have no national strategy. We lack any cohesive approach. If we all lock down for 3 weeks, we could beat it. We're not doing that. We have contradictory advice from our political leaders, and the debate over what you should do has been so thoroughly politicized that now there are people wantonly doing dangerous things because they believe that is a morally correct thing to do, not wearing masks, assembling when they shouldn't assemble. This is going to extend into the fall, and everything is going to get a lot more difficult in the fall because you will still have a tremendous number of cases, and some of the ameliorating factors like going to an outdoor restaurant will not be available once winter arrives. The future is very pessimistic. I've been on the phone pretty relentlessly with doctors in Boston, doctors in Washington, doctors in Chicago, doctors in the West Coast. It's a very depressing situation. What is hopeful, though, is that out of all this medicine, the surge of hunting for solutions, interesting things are happening. Now, too, about just one of them, and that is low-level radiation as a means of treating secondary infection or the inflammation which attends this disease and which is what's killing them. Inflammation is one of those things that is both useful in healing the body, and when it goes haywire, it is part of the problem. It is getting increasing study, and it was before the virus, but right now the chances are that if you are unlucky enough to contract the virus, in a severe case, you will either die from the inflammation or you will have your lungs damaged from a couple of weeks on a ventilator, which is a very crude and rather brutal way of forcing the lungs to work. The good news is that there's a group of doctors scattered across this country and around the world who are radiation oncologists who know something about radiation, treat cancer with it. We say very low doses can be applied to 2 patients. If you get them early enough, will get rid of the secondary inflammation, and you can then treat the primary inflammation with a steroid and other things that we use, antivirals, they're called as a group. What is coming out of this is that this therapy has other uses, including Alzheimer's and arthritis, for example. Anything with a problem is out of control inflammation. So out of the disaster comes some hope. I'm very turned on by the science that is taking place, and that's encouraging. Every war produces its set of inventions, its innovation, and we're beginning to see that. But this war is not won. It's raging, it's pernicious, and it's continuous.
All right, John, it sounds like the sky is falling. What is going on?
A bit more optimistic in terms of what we're doing. It's a great opportunity to create a case study of how Americans react to different kinds of situations, whether it's World War I, bailing out the English in World War II, whether it's doing any of these things. I think it's great to look at a situation, which I think as it has developed is very, very perhaps might be unusual. That is, I was reading this morning where America did not follow the playbook, that is the playbook for the virus. And no doubt there can be evidence of that. But it's also obvious that this virus is something else. I think that the behavior of any kind of thing that we understand, whether it's the weather, whether it's human behavior, whether it's different kinds of disease, I mean, the networking of this virus, which is trying to defend itself, is very, very interesting. I'm optimistic because as I look at the ideas that we have, and I treat it as a wartime situation. As an old Vietnam veteran, we used to wake up and say, a great day in Vietnam to die. Let's go do something great. So I think what's happening here is that if you look at other countries, do a comparison, there's no doubt that the economy is being absolutely devastated. There's no doubt that we will have new business models all over the world. And there's no doubt that if there's not a stimulus package passed very, very soon, we really don't know what would happen to the country. But here's my optimism. My optimism is that when you look at the percentages of people as we go through this thing, and it's almost getting to the point, I think, where it looks like to me, a great portion of the population will get this virus. And the question is, who will survive? It is devastating to look at the hospitals, the people who are on ventilators, and look at the unpreparedness of how we have approached this thing. But the optimism comes from the American spirit. It comes from World War II, World War I, it comes from Vietnam, it comes from all of those things. It would be devastating, and we will look back on this period as very, very devastating. But as Llewelyn said, the science will bring us through. We are finding new ways to treat this thing. But more importantly, if you look at who is dying and who is surviving. So certainly there have been hundreds of people, thousands of people who have died, but 10 times more people who have survived. So my optimism is grounded in the American spirit, but I agree with Llewelyn that it's going to be very, very devastating, but you never count out the American spirit.
All right. Well, I want to hear the perspective of a commercial real estate tycoon. So what does Austin Tree sees? What is going on in the commercial real estate world? What's COVID done to your industry?
Initially at the onset of COVID, just to compare two markets, a real estate market versus a stock market. Stock markets are incredibly liquid due to the massive volume of transactions. And so what I do is I represent tenants, and I go out and I help them lease office space. And once you lease office space, it creates essentially a fixed income bond within a building. And you take a number of bonds and you put some sort of cap rate on it, give a value of the building. So I am as liquid as real estate gets because a lot more leases happen than building sales and refinances and what have you. And so when the onset of this happened, initially demand went down 90%, but there were firms out there who unfortunately have lease expirations sort of tied to periods that are within this COVID era, i.e. 2020, and hopefully not too much further. And when you go to market, and given everything that's going on in COVID, you're hoping to see a massive, at least if you're a tenant, a massive degradation of the market so that you can get a screaming deal. But frankly, just due to the extended sales cycle that a lot of these landlords have, we haven't seen any real downturn in the market just yet, at least from a face rate standpoint. And so landlords are giving a little bit more incentives. They're keeping their face rate, and as a result, effective rates are going down. And if you look at my report, this is Q2, which is essentially 85% COVID. Rates are continuing to grow up, and quarter over quarter, they're up almost 10% compared to last year. And so, we haven't seen a massive degradation of the market, but what we are seeing, which is scary, and what I do think will lead to, increasingly downward rate pressure, is we've seen over 1.3 million square feet of sublease space come to the market. A lot of that is driven by just companies completely going belly up just due to their business model going defunct due to COVID. And a lot of it is this potential new shift in paradigm that is working from home. And so this has been the greatest sort of work from home experiment in the history of mankind. And a lot of these companies, while they're working from home, they're just saying, hell with it. Let's put our space on the market, see if we can offload our second or third largest expense as an organization. And, you know, we'll operate from home because apparently it works. Now, fast forward, you know, 2-3 months, now that people sort of understand whether or not they're keeping their job, and now that businesses are understanding, you know, are we going to make it to the other side allegedly from COVID, you're starting to see a downward tick in the productivity of these employees. And so the reason I'm saying all this is that there's been a massive increase in supply, and the real driver of whether or not these markets are going to see big downward pressure is whether or not, or basically what the demand looks like on the other side. And a lot of that's going to have to work, is going to come out of whether or not these companies can sort of work from home efficiently. And so long story short, the market hasn't really done a whole lot since the onset of COVID. And it's really just driven by the fact that no one's really doing anything. But I think over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, we're going to see, you know, Austin behaves similar to how it did in the tech wreck of 01-02, as opposed to how it did in 08-09, in which it essentially just plateaued and skyrocketed from there.
Any questions from Llewelyn or John?
Oh, yes, Austin. You know, in the stock market, I don't know if we can compare the stock market to the real estate market. And my good friend Joe Williams, who's married to an LSU Tiger, by the way, of Kellen Williams. This Jayhawk stuff is getting under my skin. And Joe is a Longhorn, and his wife is a Tiger. But you know, I think you have to look at what we were calling the stock market, the futures, and I think you have to look at the dynamic. Austin, Texas, state government, people are moving here. But if you look at the market, the biggest uptake in office space is the purchasing of small homes to go behind your house for your office space. Okay, so you should expect, I think, that Congress Avenue in Austin, and even before COVID, the mobility of people moving here was great. But I think if you look at the futures, given what has happened, it might be a good thing if people were, you know, decide to go back to the office. I happen to think that there would be a hybrid model of business enterprise. That is, some enterprises will go back to the office. And if you look at our check, people are building things to bring people back. They're putting up all of the partitions and et cetera. So my question is this: given your statistics, which I'm looking at now in terms of Austin office statistics, net of everything that has happened, what do you think that Austin, Texas, as a vibrant business community, bringing different enterprises to Austin, how will that affect you in the past? I mean, that would be looking at the futures. Let's call it the futures and how people are looking at the future. Just net of all of that, just Austin, state government, vibrant business community. So my deal is, as entrepreneurs come, then the future is a great thing for office space in Austin, but it's going to be hybrid.
I completely agree. So there are such things that people have referred to in the past as like a change agent. Like, for instance, the onset of the internet was a massive change agent for how businesses operated. COVID, in my eyes, is an accelerating agent. And what I mean by that is that prior to COVID, there were all kinds of businesses from the coast and larger, more expensive cities coming to Austin because of the business-friendly environment that Texas provides, but then also the vibrancy and the culture that Austin provides. So those same companies that were sort of thinking about it pre-COVID, I think COVID is sort of the nail in the coffin for them staying where they are. And the biggest example of that, I believe, is Tesla, which everyone knows about, and I'm sure you guys have talked about on this program many a times. But it's companies like that that are sort of getting sick and tired of how difficult it is to operate in some of these, you know, coastal cities, the political pressures they get, the tax environment, how expensive it is to employ their employees, how expensive it is for their employees to live in those cities. They look at Austin, specifically in Texas, and they get fired up. And so coming out of this on the other end, I think we're going to see a lot more relocations, just like Tesla. I think we're going to see a lot more entrepreneurs come here after they sort of follow these big name companies like Google and Facebook. Just that ecosystem is percolating. And I'm even more bullish on Austin over the next 10 years than I was over the past 10 years. To answer your question on, you know, what's the workplace strategy for most companies going to look like going forward. I think you're spot on. I think it's going to be a hybrid. If I'm looking to get hired by a couple firms and one offers, the ability to work from home for 2 days a week, but the other one doesn't, and everything else you hold equal, I'm going to go with the one that lets me work from home. I too agree that people are more productive working in the office, but frankly, just having that flexibility, even if it's for half a day or a day and a half of working from home and just getting things done or taking care of your kid or you name it. I mean, it just makes life a whole lot easier. And so we're seeing a lot of companies sort of design space with that in mind. It's more of like the hoteling type setups in which you come in, you just pick a desk, you take your stuff home because everything is in the cloud and everything is pretty mobile. And, I think the hybrid of the two is going to at least sustain that productivity we had pre-COVID, but, just the quality of life for everybody involved is going to go up. So that's a bit of a shining light in the post-COVID days.
Llewelyn?
Well, I find this, if I might say so, this hubris for Texas, disingenuous and likely to mislead people. The fact is, across the
We're trying to take over the world.
well, as the man said about the river, if you can suck as hard as you can blow, you can have it. That's an Irish joke. The thing is, across the nation, you've got probably tremendous overbuilding of office space.
Yeah.
It's not clear how completely the demand will come back. You've got two forces at work, which I'm glad to say that Austin mentioned. One is the temptation to work at home. The other is the concern about productivity with people at home, and the simple human desire to go back and work with other people, which I understand totally. But the economics of less office space are very attractive to a lot of companies. Then you have, coming on the market, an enormous amount of retail space. High quality retail space in shopping centers, high streets, or main streets as you might call them. These are the failed restaurants, the failed chain stores, some of them very large, like Neiman Marcus. You're going to have what used to be the very attractive thing in shopping centers, the so-called anchor retailer. Well, the anchor has broken its chain and it's gone. Large cinder block building, and not much you can put into it except a health club, and there are not enough health clubs to make up all that. Some people have said, and I think we said it on this program, we may be able to convert some of this surplus retail space into housing, but not very easily. Generally, it's cheaper to not start again. A bright side, and everything has a bright side, and that is that it's going to be easier for startups because it's going to be cheaper real estate. I have always loved strip malls. Why? Because in strip malls, you see new startups, you see immigrants, you see entrepreneurs. Strip malls are the incubators of new business. You can get a bit of shelter without enormous cost. There's been a big shake-up in the real estate market, and some of the big old office buildings, I don't know if any of you have ever spent any time in New York, but for every shiny palace, there's a huge old building with long, dark corridors, and you wonder whether this can continue, whether there's going to be enough demand for office space as more attractive space becomes available through the attrition that we're seeing in companies. If just one statistic, which you put out today, and that is 53% of restaurants will fail. That is a tremendous amount of street-level retail space.
Yep.
Awful lot of real estate on the market. You cannot tell me that it's going to continue just fine. The other problem we have, and I'll go back to my opening remarks, and that is we have a war indubitably. And I love Johnny's analogy. But we have a war in which we have no generals. The
seems to be absent. He's not left his tent. And that's not a good situation. Then the other generals are quarreling with each other. And you don't win wars that way. We need some sort of leadership here, or at least the appointment of a COVID czar who's going to bring this thing around. Bring us the discipline that will save our lives while we wait for a vaccine, the silver bullet, which doctors make vaccines, working on vaccines, and first, they're not sure whether they will work, but they're pretty optimistic. The second one, they're not sure of the quality control that will take place when you've got a vaccine and you have to make billions of doses. Most of these vaccines are bred in India. Quality control is a problem with the polio vaccine. It will be a problem. And with 100 vaccines possibly coming to market, there will be skullduggery. There'll be all kinds of things on and battling for position. The lobbyists will be making money and lobbying. You must take this one, that one. Science may get pushed aside in favor of other thought. And how are we going to find out the best vaccine with the best quality control and the highest chance of fast, reliable delivery to the people of the country? These are big challenges, and I don't think anybody in our government has been assigned to handle them.
Good.
Well,
Let me just ask Austin this, and I really like those comments on Llewelyn. Austin,
Sure.
Austin, you know, when we look at George Kosmeska's Technopolis that we call Austin, Texas, I thought it was very, very interesting. I myself do the research with Dave Gibson on the movement of Austin. I always thought that most of our building downtown was residential. And I saw the development of 2 downtown Austins. I saw the development of a downtown going out one right there at the old ranch in the curve with Loop 1. And we kind of looked at maybe the domain, but there's no rental stuff. I mean, there's no ownership of domain. To what extent, if you look at the if you will, the demography of where the buildings are we building downtown Austin for business enterprises, or it's 98% for residential or for condos? And given COVID and given the movement of the city, do you think that we will have another downtown in Northwest Austin just past the domain at the ranch, right where a 1 turns in going to I-35?
Sure. So to answer your question about the composition of downtown and whether or not sort of we're overbuilding. So at the moment, I know the exact figure for office. I don't know the exact figure for multifamily, which is condos, apartments, et cetera, but there's 2.5 million square feet of office space being built downtown at the moment. And the current inventory, if you will, downtown is 10.5 million. So a little over a 20% increase to downtown is going to come online between now and probably the beginning of 2023. Of that new inventory, 50% of it is already leased. So not much of it is speculative, and it's leased to quality tenants, you name it. Indeed, Facebook, Google, you know, high-end law firms that want to plant a flag in Austin. It was moving at a tremendous pace. And then you look over at the multifamily side, and the Austin proper, I'm sure you're familiar with that building, which is, you know, right there at 3rd and Nueces, I believe. They're selling at $1,000 a foot. And that was before it was even coming out of the ground. And a lot of these people bought it sight unseen before knowing that Google's going to build the biggest building downtown that Austin has ever seen, right in front of it, ruining all the views. So it was torrid, and people couldn't build buildings fast enough. Now, flash forward into today, in which, as I mentioned, there's 2.5 million square feet coming online downtown. Of the sublease space I mentioned, there's 500,000-ish square feet being built as well, which is about the equivalent of a Frost Bank Tower. Now, pair that, if all that lands at once, you know, Austin's economics are going to seriously degrade in the real estate category. I don't know what's going to happen. Who knows? People might flip a switch, and all of a sudden these massive requirements come back and we fill it up by 2023. But if not, you know, we're not going to have the success we did in 08 or 09, in which our rates only went down 3.5%, while the balance of major cities across the US were down anywhere from 10 to 25%. So relatively speaking, I think we're still going to outperform, but what does that sort of relative outperformance look like, to be determined. You asked a question about, is there going to be another downtown node in Austin, specifically Northwest? My theory is that instead of there being another node, there's simply going to be sort of a midtown that connects downtown to the domain. So everything along Burnett, everything central, you're seeing a little bit near the Highland ACC campus, you're seeing a little bit in Miller. I think this next cycle is gonna be the cycle of what's called infill. And infill typically is, buildings that are in between 100 and 150,000 square feet that are mixed use with apartments, with office space, and maybe some high-end retail, even though there's gonna be likely a surplus of that type of product going forward. And if you don't mind, I just want to jump back to a couple of comments from Llewelyn, in which, he mentioned all these restaurants going out of business and all this retail space coming back. And I 100% agree with that thesis. I mean, there's just no doubt about it with the push of e-commerce and the fact that a lot of these businesses that were being run out of retail just didn't have the balance sheet to survive COVID. Instead of it being converted into office space, I think there's a small portion that will. I think the higher end stuff that fits within, a project that's underperforming, I think if it's nice enough, office space will go into there, because at the end of the day, most people view their office space as sort of the cornerstone of their culture. It's a recruiting tool. It's a great place to sort of build a vibe, which I know to a lot of people who are entrepreneurial and don't necessarily need a bunch of team members to have that sort of peer pressure to keep you going. It's not as important, but for younger people out of college who need to be trained and are trying to make friends, where they work is extremely, extremely important. But the balance of the retail, I think, is likely going to be converted into basically last mile distribution centers. With all this push to e-commerce, and this push for convenience and consumers in which they can't wait 2 days, they need to get things 6 hours after they order it. A lot of these companies, it's going to be very easy to convert essentially this box of a retail center into a distribution center in which, the Amazon vans of the world, or the Targets or the Wayfarers, you name it, they can come in, pick up their stuff, and get to 10 or 12 neighborhoods within a 10 to 15 minute drive. So who knows what's going to happen? Rates and everything are going to get cheaper, which is great for a lot of companies. It's going to remove one of the many barriers to entry that is within our country today. And, we'll see.
Yeah. So I have a follow-up that piggybacks all that data, Austin. And a lot of people have this question, and a lot of people have asked this question over and over, especially after sort of the stock market demise of WeWork. But what's going to happen with co-working space? What's your take? Does it come back as it was conceived? Does it change? Is it a hybrid? What does it look like?
It's not. You go ahead, John.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry, Austin. Go ahead.
No, it's not going to go away by any means. It was definitely overbuilt, and a lot of that was fueled by greed, frankly, because developers, they needed to get financing in order to build these buildings, and the way that you could get financing was to pre-lease a building, and just due to the economics and the cash flow a lot of these coworkers were producing, they would do irresponsible leases now in retrospect in order to get their building built. And so a lot of those companies are going to go away, but I think the big names, there's going to be a massive consolidation to likely 3 or 4 names, and their business model is going to shift more towards a conference room heavy type offering, because if there are more companies that work from home, they're still going to need a space to meet up for these big team meetings, or potentially have all hands meetings or what have you. And so businesses, if they're 90% work from home, they'll have 3, 4, 5 hot offices that are tied to 2 or 3 conference rooms that for the 1 or 2 or handful of people that just can't work at home for whatever reason, have a place to work. And then, like I mentioned, for those bigger team meetings, everybody can come into this co-working office and meet all day and order in food and and be productive on a project in which they just can't do or be nearly as productive virtually.
All right. So
I've got a question. I've got a question.
Okay.
Austin, I found what you had to say very interesting, especially about the repurposing of retail space. I wonder, of course, whether there really are going to be enough warehouse functions. But the other thing which Andre raised, which interests me, is co-working. And what I've seen of it, it works when there's commonality among the tenants. The National Press Building in Washington is a case in point. The Common District in New York, where you'll see 5 or 6 dressmaking firms in the same building, sharing a lot of things. When they are disparate, when they're simply there because they need office space and maybe some shared telephone answering the secretariat, I think it's a lot less compelling. Are you going to go out and developing these properties, or is anybody going to look for the synergies of similarity, of common endeavor, which tend to make things work? It's certainly very clear in many lines of endeavor that it's a lot better if everybody in the building is basically in competition, because they're also in some state, in some way, they're comrades in arms. Otherwise, if one fellow is a law, practicing law, and a woman is being a financial advisor, and somebody else is trying to do export, import, the commonality is very low. They may say hello in the corridor around the water cooler and those services that are common, like a conference room, but really they don't have much in common, and that's appealing to people. People like to fly with similar birds.
All right, I'm gonna take a time out real quick. I gotta do my plug of my Digital 360 Summit. I'm gonna share my screen real quick with you all and remind you that the virtual Digital 360 Summit via Zoom is coming up August 18th, 19th, 20th, and then August 25th, 26th, 27th. It is 12 sessions, 6 days. We have actually over 70 speakers confirmed now, 16 keynotes, 11 panels, and we will have 11 white papers and 28 videos after that. And we're covering all kinds of industrial focus verticals, from networks to sensors to data, software, utilities, cities, mobility, buildings and infrastructure, energy and utilities, water, wastewater, space, and smart factories. So don't miss it. Come and check it out. Look for all the information promoting it all over. This is the list of companies that are speaking. It's a pretty respectable number of companies. And I want to thank Texas State University for sponsoring the Digital Roundtable. With that said, let me come back and let me share with you a couple things about on the smart building front, which is near and dear to the world of commercial real estate. There's a lot of stuff going on with automation. Lighting and lighting controls market is growing super fast. Seems to be the #1 thing that every building retrofit is dealing with these days. And then front, the whole notion of home, Internet of Things devices, that market is growing dramatically. In fact, it's growing 18% so far compared to last year, despite the pandemic. So clearly there's a lot going on in improvements, automation, making things easier. I've always said that, with COVID, doors should have no knobs and they should open up and close like a Star Trek, walk to the door kind of thing. Austin, what are you seeing in terms of customers and partners of yours pushing automation now? Is it accelerating? Is it the same? What's your take?
So it's definitely accelerating. As I mentioned, COVID is an accelerating agent as opposed to a change agent. And so things that people have been thinking about for a long time are starting to be, they're starting to come to fruition. And so there's smaller things like you mentioned in which we are seeing companies put in automatic doors, because to your point, I don't, you know, in an effort to get people comfortable coming back to work, you know, you want to have the cleanest and safest thing possible. And so to show that you're, you know, dotting your I's and crossing your T's, automated doors is a really big and easy one. Automated sinks in the restroom, toilets, automated soap, automated water distribution. All of those things are definitely sort of being implemented because they're easy fixes. And in the past, it was just kind of annoying to get done. And then there's obviously a capital hurdle.
Yeah.
On a broader scale, there are, you know, smart and sustainable technologies that are a little bit harder to implement that people, I think going forward, are going to make a point about putting that in the workplace because once again, you got to get people comfortable with coming back. And I don't think that this competition for talent is going to go anywhere anytime soon, excuse me, especially in the high tech world. So one thing that I think is really interesting is that they're putting these nodes on all these Wi-Fi readers in offices, and basically companies will track how often you're at your desk, how often certain conference rooms are being used, how often you're there, what time you come in, and eventually when you get this critical mass of data, one, you can build out your space more efficiently, so therefore you're not leasing as much, which helps people save money. And on a broader scale, if we don't need to build as many buildings, and there's sort of a sustainability bent there. But another thing is that eventually, if you can tie that data into building systems, i.e., you know, the arms in the garage, like if they know what time you're coming in or what time you usually do, like they're going to be open. Or when you walk up to an elevator, it's going to know exactly what floor you're going to. And again, it'll just feel like you haven't had to push or touch or think about anything from your car up to your seat. And even beyond that, I mean, it could have a coffee ready for you at your desk. So those, I think, operationally are definitely coming. And then, and this is sort of my theory, more longer term, as far as more sustainable, smart building tech is concerned. I think that because there's going to be a reduction in the amount of office being used, but there's still going to be a demand for office, I think if you're a developer and you're trying to attract a tenant into your new development project so you can build it, it has to be, I think, almost 100% green. I think some of the building materials need to be this cross-laminated timber or have some sort of wood bent into the structure. I think the windows need to absorb heat and potentially generate that into electricity. I mean, I think you're going to have every bell and whistle in order to pull somebody out of a building that we see now, the same way that all these glass buildings are pulling tenants out of, you know, the pink granite buildings that we see downtown. So I think long term, it's going to make our city even more beautiful. I think it's going to make the earth more sustainable and a better place. And I think, you know, electricity and sort of smart tech is going to go a long way in all of that.
Yeah. John, Llewelyn?
Well, I'm going to ask, what's going to happen? How do you counter the magnet city effect, where cities like Boston, San Francisco, your own, attract everyone, and essentially bigger other cities, or London sucks all the energy out of the United Kingdom, or at least out of England, because that's where everybody must be, that's where everybody wants their office, and that's in some proximity they want to live. The same is true of San Francisco. It's very true of Boston. True.
What's your question?
Well, the question is, what do we do about the lesser cities, and what do we do about rural America? Now that we can work at home, are we going to see a flourishing of urban and ex-urban development?
Sure, like a flight to the suburbs.
And what are you going to do about traffic in these cities?
Well, you know, let me just comment on that. You know, Texas Monthly had an issue about 3 months ago on wealth moving to the rural, and that's fine. And also think that everyone would not want to be in a city. If you look at the research on cities, for example, 98% of all the great companies in the last 50 years have been founded in 128 in Boston, Austin, Texas, and Silicon Valley. And because of that, there's a certain traction of of a certain kind of worker coming to the city. And I think that the emphasis on high-tech workers or the emphasis on education, I think something like 52% of Austinites have a formal education. I think all of those create a certain kind of city. It doesn't mean that other things will not happen. For example, if you look at the hill country of Texas, it's absolutely gorgeous. If you look at Fredericksburg, and also I'm a Southerner, we don't call them suburbs, we call them small towns, by the way, just a little correction there.
I think that the novelist called them edge cities.
Edge cities, yes. Yeah. So you're right. I think it's going to turn, but I think planning in this way is very serendipity. That is, we can, and I plan around innovation and I plan around entrepreneurship, right? So I think what will happen is that you got to realize that in the scheme of things, over the last 60 years, Silicon Valley was created by Boston. Austin was created by Silicon Valley. Round Rock will be created by Austin. So there's a movement of talent, there's a movement of innovation and entrepreneurship. So selling here has to do with all of those things, especially the University of Texas at Austin, I might add. That's why Tesla is coming here, because of our engineering department. But you're right, Llewelyn, but I think there's the synergy and movement of cities. And if you look at the research over the last number of years, it is the talent. If the talent moves from Austin to Waco, then Waco changes. If the talent moves from the United States to Canada, then the United States changes. Most of our great companies have been immigrants, whether it's Google and other kind of companies, people who came here, for immigration. So I think that we will continue to have the movement of people based on talent of where they go. And I think in rural areas, there will be more of retirement, there will be more of a relaxation. And you can vision Texas looking like like New York. You have Manhattan where nobody wants to be, but everybody works, but then they want to get away to the smaller cities to relax. So again, I can see all of that developing, but it's very, very hard to plan.
So Austin, on that vein, do we see an exodus from downtown towards the edge cities, or what's growing faster? What do you think is going to happen in the next 10 years?
Well, I was a member of an organization that looked at.
I was just asking Austin, John.
Oh, I'm sorry, Austin. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. I think it's not going to necessarily, in my opinion, be a flight to the edge cities or the suburbs or the small towns, as you call it. Mm-hmm. I think just these big towns draw people to them for a couple of things. And I think there's a value proposition there. It's an energy, first and foremost, and then can you really afford to live there? And so I think initially the flight from Boston to San Francisco was for exactly that. There's an energy there, I can afford to live there. And then the reason for the flight from Silicon Valley to Austin is largely driven by eventually it's just too expensive to enjoy the energy, and you go somewhere else that has something comparable, and therefore it's easy and justifiable to make that switch without dropping your quality of life. And so I think people in general are still going to want to be around other people and experience other things that are beyond experiences that you can achieve online, in my opinion. And so cities that are more dense and more urban, I think will continue to thrive. Now, how companies will basically combat price or combat commutes that you mentioned earlier, Llewelyn, is they're going to have multiple offices. And so I think Austin is a town in which you really only need 2 offices to give everybody in the entire city an enjoyable commute. And right now you're seeing a couple of companies do that. There's companies like Facebook that have a big office in the Domain and a big office downtown. Both locations have that energy and walkability and access to amenities that younger and middle managerial type folks want. While at the same time, if you get a job at Facebook and you live in Georgetown, you don't have to drive an hour downtown and an hour plus home, given the massive congestion in our city. And so I think that COVID will spur a minor flight to less dense parts of urban towns. Now, this is a little off topic, but what I think will spur an even further flight to suburbans or edge cities is going to be automated driving, right? Because if at some point you can get in a car and you don't have to drive, you don't care if your commute's an hour and a half, especially if you can work the whole way. So I can see people living full time in the Fredericksburgs and the beautiful parts of the rolling, Texas Hill Country, if it just means they get in their Tesla and they can watch a show and do their work, and all of a sudden they get to work and they don't feel like they've been beaten down by an hour and a half, 2-hour drive. So, and everything cycles too. I think.
Yeah, no, but that's a great point to my last. We're on the final stretch here. My last point on the sort of the news. We talk about all these digital transformations happening. I think one driven by the Tesla move to Austin and the fact that electric vehicles are winning. It's just there are 3 big events happening this week that Southern California Edison is about to get approval from the Public Utility Commission in California to deploy a $442 million EV charging infrastructure in their service territory, which is basically, Los Angeles area, right? And all the New York IOUs, so Consolidated Edison and many others, have a package in front of the Public Service Commission in California to approve a $700 million EV charging infrastructure deployment in New York. And then the same week announcements, there's a startup in Florida called BEEP, B-E-E-P, which is deploying the first AV automated vehicle shuttles built using 3D technology. So could you care to comment on what's happening? It seems like EVs are coming. The utilities are spending billions of dollars building the infrastructure. The Teslas are ready to be bought. Everybody wants autonomous vehicles. Austin already called it as the next trend. What's going to happen, gentlemen? Llewelyn?
Well, I think that you've got to look not only at the electrification of transportation. That's coming. It's just a matter of how fast. I would hope that we can get beyond the wire, that we can get recharging stations where the vehicles do not actually have to connect to wire.
You want wireless charging?
Well, I think it'll be more efficient.
Sure.
You get rid of a worry, but it's coming. It doesn't matter. Electric vehicles are coming. We needn't worry about that. But so are drones for baggage delivery. So are a lot of other things, possibly automated vehicles. Public transportation, we used to think of as trains and buses. Now it looks like it may also include scooters and mopeds and some development on that, so that the future is not as clear as it might have been. It's not a linear growth of traffic as we've seen it. It's different, the changes. We're also very close to electric air taxis. They exist. I've been talking to the man in Switzerland, who was the great advocate, the man who flew a solo plane all around the world. He thinks it's not far away. Boeing is working, every big company is working on it. That will make a big difference. And of course, new buildings will have to have a place to park these taxis. Have to sit on the roof, or they're going to have to sit in the quadrangle somewhere. We're going to see changes in the shape of buildings to accommodate it, same way the buildings change to accommodate aerials, that all look at the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, they all go up with a great aerial on the top. Now you may want a platform on the top, as the old Pan Am Building in New York had a platform on the top for helicopters. It wasn't hugely popular, but there are other pressures on a city besides the predictable. I think the greening of buildings is very, very important. Buildings are huge wasters of energy. They can, in fact, be very carbon neutral, and possibly using all of their external spaces be generators of electricity.
Yeah, let me get John's take on. Let me get John's take on. Yeah, John.
Well, very quickly, we're switching from horses and buggies to the combustion engine. But obviously, when we did that, everything changed. But remember that at one time, Austin was all electrified. New Orleans was electrified. Our buses ran on on electrical components with wires on top. And then all of that was changed. Now, you should also expect a fight between those who still love the combustion engine and the Teslas. So all of my friends who have Teslas, what they say is that, well, you know, I'm trying to get to a charging station and somebody with a damn combustion engine is parked in front of that station, so we cannot talk. People say that, well, you know, if you want a big golf cart, go to the golf course and fill that thing up. Let me buy it with my real automobile. But obviously it's changing, but here is the big question. Will the change to be significant enough? I think some cities will change. I don't think all cities will change. I don't think rural will change. But the question is, do I want to be caught with my Tesla in Lukenbach, Texas? Do I want to be caught with my Tesla in Amite, Louisiana? So I think in addition to what cities do, what we call the social structure of cities, how they change with the technology, we really have to look at what Llewelyn would call the interconnection between the rural and the urban. How people move from place to place. Will I sit here and say, you know, I've got to go to Dallas, but I've got a plan where all of the things are? Well, you know, in the future, you can imagine the real scientist Tesla, that thing might be running off the movement of the earth. You know, Tesla believed that we had enough energy to fund everything, to run everything based on the movement of Nikola Tesla. So I think these things are interesting, just like when we move from computers, from typewriters to computers, from combustion engines, right, to another mode of transportation. It's going to be very, very interesting. But the infrastructure has to be built, but it will not be even across the board.
Right.
The rest of the country is not Austin, Texas. The rest of the country does not have the vision, does not have the wealth, it does not have the leaders with the foresight to say we really need to make the cities in the electrical way.
I just told you that LA and New York are doing it. So Austin, closing remarks.
Seattle.
Austin Trees, please.
No, I appreciate your guys' time. It's been great getting to know you guys. I think Austin is well positioned to excel on many fronts, including real estate. And I'll be sure to tune in further to keep up with you guys. Thanks again for having me. Sort of out of my league here.
All right. Sorry to interrupt you, Llewelyn. Llewelyn, closing remarks?
Well, I'm going to tell you about a little piece of entrepreneurism which fascinates me. An immigrant from Pakistan, somewhere out, I think it was in Los Angeles, I talked to him on the phone, and he had a new business, which are trucks with generators on. So when your Tesla was flat, by calling AAA, you call him and he brings a truck around and he gives you enough charge to get you home. That's entrepreneurism, that's immigration at work, and that's indication of the future, which will not be necessarily as we think it might.
I agree with that.
I would like a piece of that business. I would like a piece of that business.
I can see trucks parked in lay-bys, you know, these rest areas, as an interim before we build out all this fabulous infrastructure. There are ways of doing it, you know, probably be fairly expensive because you'll have to have a diesel generator on the truck. But instead, you need a little gas, and the equivalent of a little gas, a little charge. You'll be happy to see the truck and pay the money.
That's right. Closing remarks, Dr. Go Fish.
Well, you know, I think that this is very interesting because, you know, I do research on cities and how they change, whether they are gateway cities like New York and San Francisco and Miami. They've always provided a lot of the technologies in the country. But what has changed is the fact that we do not need great waterways anymore. We do not need ships anymore. We can make a great city with just brains and technology and all of the electricity that we need. It would be interesting to look at and trace how these cities will develop. But what we do know, given the speed up of the COVID and given the fact that people like to get together, I envision other modes of business enterprise. For example, I envision modulars in office space and not people together. I envision a big deal in putting office space behind people's houses as going on now, so that they can move from the house to a very, very small office on their land. It's exciting times for those of us in innovation. It's sad times for those of us who lose our jobs. But when it comes to what we look at in the future, it is very, very interesting times.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you all for today. And if John wants to take us away with maybe some tune, I'm thinking something French. I don't know why.
S'il compte en grand, je vais vous faire une lettre, quand vous direz peut-être, si vous avez le temps. Je viens de recevoir mes papiers militaires pour aller à la guerre, mercredi soir. Mais si qu'on en grand, je ne veux pas la faire, je ne suis pas sur la terre pour tuer les faux gens. Si vous me percevez, prévenez vos gendarmes, que je serai sans armes et qui pourra tirer, et qui pourra tirer. Or as we say in Baton Rouge.
Wonderful. Wonderful.